Are coming with these changes. Well, Dave Riordan is the Associate VP of the Midwest Sales for GFK MRI. He's going to tell us all about it. Go ahead, Dave.
All right, thanks, Ross. How's everyone doing? Are we hanging in there? It's a little warm in here. So,
it's like a sauna in here.
Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about the changing ways that audiences are interacting with TV. Those of you who are familiar with MRI, you probably know us from our survey of the American consumer. So this is where we're collecting and delivering data on the American consumer. So all aspects of them, though. Who they are, what they buy, how they think, and how to reach them. What I'm going to show you today is new. So over the last couple years, we've been doing some additional research, specifically focusing on TV. So, examples of that. What qualities of individual programs are really driving viewers to those programs? What networks our particular audience is really passionate about? And again, what qualities are driving that passion? And a third aspect that I'm going to talk about mostly today is with so many different choices in not only content providers, but ways to consume that content, how do you make sense of it? What's changing? What's the current situation? So what I'm going to present today is a lot of hard data. And I apologize in advance for being so late in the afternoon, so warm and a lot of numbers, but hopefully we can have some fun today. All right, so let's start with what is TV? And of course, that's a very personal thing. Different consumers have different answers. 48% say TV is anything on a TV set. 21% say it's anything I can watch on any device, so it doesn't even matter. 18% only shows that are available via cable, satellite, a cord. And then 13% only shows created by a TV network. Now, what's really interesting here is when you look at those first two bars, that's almost 70% of consumers that they don't care how they're getting it or who's producing it. As long as it's on a TV or one of their devices and it moves, they consider that TV, which is kind of game-changing if you think about it. They're completely agnostic to where it's coming from. One of the other things we asked about in the survey was what percentage of your time spent viewing content is devoted to different methods. So you can see live is still the majority. 56% of total time viewing program content is live. 21% is streaming. 23% is time shifted via DVR or video on demand. 62% agree live TV is important. And what we asked for this question is, do you believe it is important to watch a program live as it airs? And it's really interesting that this actually stays true when you look at people who are streamers and when you look at millennials, who we'll see in a minute are really driving a lot of these changes. So there still is very much a place in people's minds for appointment viewing. All right, so how are they actually consuming this content? 60% of viewing time is still TV through a TV service. And we've been doing this long enough that we can establish some small trends. So what we're seeing here in parentheses is year over year. That's down from 64% a year ago. So it is a little bit of a downtick. And where we're seeing some increases is TV set through an internet-connected device. So we define that as a Chromecast, a Roku, a smart TV, something that plugs into a TV is getting a signal from the web. What I think is really interesting, and we'll dive into this a little bit more, is the smartphone and tablet end of things. Smartphone, if you just look at a percent increase, that's the biggest on here, going from 3% of time to 5% of time. That's about a 66% increase, so that's huge. All right, but live TV and TV on TV is still dominating. So why is that? Well, we didn't just ask what people are doing, but we tried to get into what attitudes are driving that behavior. And really, it's habitual. So when people sit down to watch program content, we ask them, what's the first thing you do? 25% say they channel surf first. So why do they do that? They told us it's habit, and it's easy to find something to watch. What else do people do? Well, 1 in 5, they go live first. And this is going, sitting down with a specific program in mind, and they're watching that live. And why are they doing that? It's habit and FOMO, fear of missing out. So, again, there really is a place in people's minds still for appointment viewing, for TV as an event. It's something that we all come together and do, and they're going to be left out if they don't do it. Another thing behind this is 6 in 10 hate spoilers. They told us that it's important for them to see a program live as it airs to avoid getting spoilers via their friends or social media. All right, so now's the part where I talk about millennials and how they're ruining everything, or really just changing it. 56% of general market screen time was live. When you look at just millennials, 18 to 34, we're seeing that shrink to about 41%. And really what's getting, not too surprising, the additional share is time-shifted streaming. And it gets a little more complicated when you break that down further. So 10% of the viewing is live, but it's not even on a TV, it's on a different device. 19% of their total viewing is time-shifted streaming via something that's not a TV. What does this add up to? Well, 29% of the time they're consuming video content, they're not even in front of a TV set. So it is a changing landscape, and it is largely driven by age and generation. So to put some context behind that number, if you look at boomers, they're consuming 7 times more live TV than they are streaming content. If you look at Gen Xers, they're consuming about twice as much live TV as streaming content. When you look at millennials in a given week, that proportion is nearly equal. So this is something we're keeping an eye on, and it's almost a sure bet that the next bubble we put up there is going to be even further up and to the left. Another interesting thing that's coming out of the millennial generation is they're really expanding TV beyond the TV, right? So we have a couple waves of data, 3 waves of data to look at. And when you look at the share of viewing time that's TV through a TV service, yeah, that's going down a little bit from 38 to 36. What I really think is more interesting is if you look at the share for a laptop or a PC. I consider this sort of the original streaming media receiver, right? So that's going down. What's going up? Again, it's that mobile, so smartphone and tablet, and also the share of time that's devoted to an internet-connected device that's attached to a TV. So it's really 2 different directions. Millennials are taking that streaming content away from the computer, and they're going either to something that makes it more like a traditional TV experience, or they're bringing it down to mobile, which is something much more personal and always with them. Let's talk a little bit more about that 35% of streaming time. Now, this represents both a threat and an opportunity. What I have up there is the penetration numbers we have for each of the top several streaming services that we measure in this. And what you can see is that the shaded ones are the ad-enabled ones. Out of that top 5, only 2 of them are really ad-enabled. So that's a threat. Now, where the opportunity is that among millennials, they average 4 streaming services. So if you find that a certain service is really resonating with the audience you're trying to reach, and it's not ad-enabled, the odds are you're going to be able to reach them in 1, 2, 3, 4, several other different places. And we'll look a little bit more at that crossover in a few minutes. Another big difference that millennials are driving compared to the general population is, we're going back to that question of what do you do when you first sit down to watch TV? And millennials, more so than any other group, are showing streaming behaviors as their kind of default when they sit down. So 23% say they go to a show on a streaming service. So, I'm going to go watch House of Cards. 12% are saying that they're going to channel surf. Surf on a streaming service. So they're going down, they don't know what they're going to watch. They're going to try and find something new. That adds up to about 35% versus 40% of just traditional behaviors. So channel surfing, going to a favorite network, going to a show live. And we expect this proportion to really get even, and then probably streaming is going to overtake it. We'll have to see what the next couple waves of data look like, but that's definitely what the trend is right now. Streaming is dominating. So, what does that mean? Well, there's a lot of content. About 70% of streamers have streamed a full TV show. About 70% are using these streaming technologies and devices to look at short video clips. And we're showing about 50% are watching movies, and this is over a 30-day period, and about 50% are watching original programming. So when you look at those percentages, there's a ton of overlap. So you can't really zero in on just the movie streamer or just the original programming streamer. Most people are streaming a wide variety of content over a given period. Another behavior we're noticing, and we'll talk about cord cutting in a minute, you see cord cutting almost everywhere. It's a threat, it's happening all over the place. We're not really seeing it as dramatic as you would think. The sky is not falling. About 74% of streamers still have a cable or satellite subscription. What we're seeing as a far more likely scenario is that people are keeping their cord and they're stacking services on top of that. So we call them stackers. Where's the opportunity here? Well, there's really an opportunity if you're a content provider to partner up. Looking at Amazon Prime is a great example. Now you can subscribe to Showtime and Starz through your Amazon Prime account. And you don't just get VOD on-demand content, but you actually get the live station. And that is a huge disruption because now you have people who have a cable service and they're bypassing that entirely to subscribe to these premium channels through an OTT service, Amazon Prime. It's a crazy world out there right now. So obviously those two are not ad-enabled. But if this trend continues and we're starting to see ad-enabled services go through something like Amazon Prime, what are you missing out on? Well, there's a lot of advertising opportunities more on a local level through an MSO or through a satellite provider, and that gets bypassed entirely if they're going through a service that doesn't hit that. All right, so looking at the big four, it's interesting that there's a distinct demographic profile for a lot of these. We know that Hulu, based on our research, it tends to be younger, tends to have a less incidence of cable viewership. We know that Amazon Prime tends to be older, tends to be a little more affluent, they have more kids in the household. Since we've linked this data back to our national study, which has a ton of brand and purchasing information, we're also able to develop sort of a brand profile for each of these services. So what we're seeing up here, and this is just kind of for fun, is the highest indexing brands for each of these in a couple different categories. So we can also tell you that Hulu, they index pretty highly on Budweiser, and Amazon Prime, they're really more likely to be Sam Adams drinkers. So what's the opportunity here? Well, if you know what the profile of these services looks like, you can really pick something that is best suited to the audience you're trying to reach. You can also look at it another way. Again, since we have purchasing data and all the national study data linked to this, what you can really do is further build out your profile of your target consumers. So if you're trying to reach convertible drivers, they're going to look different than minivan drivers, who are going to look a little different than SUV drivers, right? And now we can fill out a little bit of the missing pieces of information. We can look at cord cutting behavior, we can look at streaming services. So the convertible drivers, they're cord shavers, which means they're kind of decreasing their cable. For TV networks, more general interest, Weather Channel, ESPN, Fox News. Streaming services, they're light, they're non-streamers. And we can fill out the other media behavior as well to get sort of a complete picture of what these people are doing offline. Compare that to, say, the minivan drivers, and that's a little different. We find that they're more likely to be cord cutters. Not too surprising, their TV viewership tends to be kids programming. They're median streamers. They'll watch Netflix, Amazon Prime, big into ABC. And they're light primetime TV. And as a father of two kids, I can attest that primetime, I'm trying to get into bed. And then we can build out that a little bit further. So maybe we want to look at a likely prospect for convertible drivers. We don't have to just target by convertible drivers, of course. We can build out a profile of what these people look like. And then we can go find these people and what streaming services are most relevant for them. And that's a more complicated question than you might think. Because with the average millennial subscribing to 4 services, there's a lot of overlap between all of this. And we can make sense of that too from the research that we pulled. People aren't just YouTube viewers or Netflix viewers or Hulu viewers. And the overlap, as I mentioned, is just really more than you would think. And the opportunity here is awesome if you were trying to reach a group that is really more likely to be, say, Netflix users. You can figure out where else to find them. So, 75% of Netflix users are also Hulu subscribers. That's a huge insight and can really help guide, where you're putting your budget. And then let's talk a little bit about where mobile viewing figures into this. So we're showing about 39% of Americans are watching video content on their mobile devices. And I thought this was fascinating. Nearly 1 in 3 say their family's often watching programs on different screens in the same room, which there is something to be said for family togetherness, but also a huge value also on family harmony, making sure everyone's getting what they want. 40% of mobile viewers say that watching on the go is very important to them, and 18% say they're doing more mobile viewing than they were a year ago, which is not terribly surprising as the options and methods become more readily available. 30% are watching TV video content on their smartphones, 16% are watching on a tablet. And we expect that number to grow for smartphones due to this one simple stat. 1 in 3 say they would watch more TV on their smartphone if the screen was bigger. Whereas the trend right now, definitely toward bigger screens. So we expect that, again, to increase a bit. All right, so cord disruption. Well, it's not as violent as depicted here, but it is happening. What we wanted to do is take a deeper dive into not just do people have cable, do they not, but getting a little deeper than that. We developed a segmentation that's really based on past behavior, as well as what consumers say they're going to do in the future. So it's everything from cord increasers, and these are the people who say they're adding cable services, to the cord nevers. So we do separate out cord cutters and cord nevers, which, it's really 2 distinct groups. What we're finding is that 60% of Americans are still cord loyalists. So they have cable, they like it, they have no intention on changing. And we can really simplify this. So, we can group these segments into 3 main buckets. 67% are cord content, 12% are cord tepid, 21% are cordless. And I think the way that you look at this data really depends on if you're a content provider or a marketer. 12% are really at risk. That's the cord tepid group. It doesn't really seem like that large of a number if you're a marketer. It's something to watch. Imagine if you're a cord provider, though, and 12% of your audience has a possibility of just up and cutting. I mean, that's a little bit terrifying. So definitely something that we're looking at and looking at implications. All right, and a little bit about binge viewing. So how many people in this room consider themselves binge viewers? A few. And this is really something that's been fun to watch. I think 5 years ago probably is when I first started talking about this. And binge viewing was seen as sort of a negative thing. Oh my gosh, I wasted my whole weekend watching 3 seasons of Star Trek. And now attitudes are really changing. What we're showing is that about 70% of those that binge view end up with really positive feelings around it. So these include things like, I feel up to date, I feel accomplished from watching TV all weekend. And it's true though, isn't it? There's some negative feelings associated with it as well. I think I'm gonna show a clip right now from an Amazon commercial around binge viewing that really hit home for me.
In 38 minutes, your favorite show is ending forever. You know what's coming. A show. The fear of having nothing left to watch takes hold. Buried alive by finale phobia. Is this how it ends? Choking on couch corn? No. You've got Amazon Fire TV. It suggests new faves so you can binge bravely. Ha 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 ha! So long, show hole!
So how many people have found themselves in the show hole? Yeah, a few. And binge viewing behavior is kind of reinforcing. After you're done, you're like, what's next? I need to find something else to watch. And that's what makes it a huge threat. 62% regularly binge view, and we define that as about half the time or more, they're sitting down to watch 3 or more episodes of a show in a row. How are people binge watching? Well, 3 in 4 are using streaming services. And this is really the biggest threat because most of those streaming services are not ad enabled, right? So that kind of disrupts a way to get your message to this audience. 1 in 6 are using DVR. 1 in 6 are using traditional TV marathons. And 1 in 7 are using video on demand services. 79% of streamers regularly binge compared to 40% of non-streamers. So really we're seeing that streaming behavior at least correlated with the binge viewing. And really, what I'll leave you at, we're talking about the show hole, we're talking about it being self-reinforcing. 34% of binge viewers really do find themselves in that show hole. So after they stream, they're figuring out what's next. They're right away searching for that next episode. So I'll leave you with this. There's a lot going on in T-video, and there's a lot of changes happening. And the more I talk about it, the more I talk to our partners, the more I realize we're kind of all in this together, trying to figure out what's going on and trying to get a handle on it. The future is going to belong to those that keep an open mind and those that have the most knowledge to arm themselves with so that they can develop the strategies to get around a lot of these disruptions. So here's the good research, here's the learning from each other, and thanks for your time.
Great, thanks, Dave. So questions from the audience? Anybody? We might have time for like one question before we move on to the next final session. Oh, over here? Yes. Just, tell us who you are and where you work.
I'm Jenny Hoskins. I work here at the Integer Group. And I was just wondering if any of this data took into account second screen viewing. I think you had a slide on it, but there's millennials who are actually watching live TV, but was any of that measuring if they were looking at Snapchat while watching the news or anything like that?
No, there wasn't. And I wish I had a better answer than that because that is an interesting question. So what we're asking for that percentage of time spent per screen is we're asking the respondent to think about all of their time viewing program content in a given week and just to assign a percentage to each of the methods that they used.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Another quick question? Anyone? No? All right, well, Dave, thanks very much.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks. Okay, folks, thanks. You've arrived at the final session of the day. Thanks for sticking around. Come to the stage, please. Here to lead this one, we asked Aaron Bate. I might say this wrong. Sorry, Aaron. He's the founder of Faction Media. So please welcome Aaron and his panel.
All right, hello, it's Aaron Batt, and I am the founder and president of Faction Media. We're a digital marketing and technology agency based here in Denver. And I am going to welcome to the stage our panelists here. We have Ryan Wilson at the end, founder and CEO of 550. We have Jessica Manelli, vice president of account management at Merkle, and Sean Baker, the president of IMM. And I want to give each of you guys a little bit of time to introduce yourselves, your experience, and your background in the not just the programmatic space, but the marketing and advertising space. Sean, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Is this working? Flip it on. Oh, you might have to flip it on. Yeah, see, that's what happens when you go first. Sean Baker, president of IMM. Hey, Beth, how are you doing? Beth used to work at IMM. President of IMM, the agency's about 10 years old, and we're located just up the road in Boulder, and so hopefully we get to drive through some snow. That'll be very exciting to get home today. I have been in the business for far too long, and I started in direct marketing at a company called Rapp Collins, and I stayed within the Omnicom world for about 15 years, and I came to IMM about 3 years ago. And then I took over the presidency in about April of this year.
Hello, I'm Jessica Manelli. I've been working in digital marketing for about 16 years. Came up through more traditional agencies like the Razorfishes of the world and Cara and those more traditional media buying agencies, but I'm now with Merkle, and I oversee a large book of business within our media accounts, some heavy programmatic buying. So I'm excited to be here.
I'm Ryan Wilson. I've been in the industry for about 16 years too. My route was more from the technology side. Kind of came up through consulting and then performance-based marketing. Started 550. This is our 5th year, and we do a lot of programmatic and also display and whatnot generally.
Nice. So I think it's the obligation of the final moderator of the day to remind the panelists that you're the only thing standing between a room of marketers and the alcohol outside.
Yeah, we get
So
that.
we're gonna move through this. We're gonna try to save a little bit of time for Q&A because I think that there are some interesting questions that might arise. But I'm gonna start off by telling you guys a story that I didn't even think of until I was walking into the hotel. And I shared with some friends outside just before the panel. But the last time I spoke at a MediaPost event was OMA in San Francisco. After the event, I got mugged. And I'm not 100% sure that it wasn't an audience member. So if I say anything that offends you all, I apologize in advance.
Or a panelist.
Or, or more likely a panelist. So I wanted to kick this off today by saying that I think the problem of solving for fraud and transparency and viewability is a lot like snow in Colorado. Everybody's talking about it, but nobody ever believes it's going to happen. That actually isn't true because I wrote that joke this morning and then it started snowing. So maybe there is actually hope for our industry after all. But I want to start it off by saying we talk about these these issues together, kind of this lumping together of what really is 3 separate issues. And they're pervasive in programmatic, but they're also pervasive in the digital media space and the larger media space. So I want to kind of separate them here at first and talk about each individually, talk about why they're issues and how the industry is looking at solving them. And I think I'm going to start with you, Ryan, and talking about fraud. Maybe you can just set the scene for us a little bit.
Sure. So fraud is something that I think everybody who buys media deals with in some way or not, whether you realize it or you don't. I think I did a little research to figure out kind of how big the fraud market is, and I came up with some studies that said about $7 billion in ad revenues are lost to fraud, are projected to be lost this year, and I think it was 6 last year. And so that sounds like a huge number. And when you compare it to the total sort of ad spend, digital ad spend, you get a number of about 190 billion. So we're talking about 3% roughly of the ad spend. And certainly there's areas where it's going to index a little higher for fraud than other areas. But I think ad fraud is something that has been a part of digital media buying since digital media buying was a thing. In some ways it's better than it was. In some ways the market's bigger, so the impact is worse.
Definitely. Jessica, you want to talk a little bit about viewability?
Sure.
What the issues are,
Yeah.
what the industry is doing to address them?
Yeah, so I think everyone's sort of talking about viewability in the context of, pixels loaded and, for a length of time that you see an ad on a page, whether it's a video or a mobile platform or desktop. But I really think that the core of the issue or what we should be talking about is, are you reaching the right people, right? So we're still talking about this in context of cookies and proxies versus actual people. So I think it's important that we start to think about viewability in the context of reaching an audience and being able to actually map back those impressions to individuals. Did you match to that person? Did they see the ad? Did they take action? So I think there's still a lot of sort of discussion around viewability as a channel and as a placement, but really we should be shifting that conversation.
Thanks. Sean, how about a little bit about transparency?
Yeah, save that one for me. Great. So transparency, right, is, to me, it goes all the way to the core of a relationship between an agency and their client. And I believe that the real problem is that the lack of transparency is based around the initial agreement between a client and their agency. And if you are doing a deal with your agency, if you're a brand and you're doing a deal with your agency, and it's commission-based, right? Then what you're actually doing is you're paying them to be an efficient administrator of your media dollars. Has nothing to do with performance, right? I'll get to transparency in a second. And if you're on the agency side and you're accepting that deal, and by the way, those deals are negotiated, right? Big time. And you're negotiated, if you're on a commission basis, that commission starts at whatever it starts at, and it ends somewhere much further south, right, than when you start. And so the dollars at play are such that, as an agency, you've got to figure out a way to stay in business. And what ends up happening is agencies are smart, right? And they know much more about what's happening than their clients do. And therein lies the problem, because again, they're being paid to be an efficient administrator of a client's dollars, not on what actually happens. And so it creates a situation that's ripe for a lack of transparency about what actually happens. So what I'm trying to suggest is that you need to go back to formula in terms of what your agreement is between your client and your agency. And I'm suggesting that it has to be performance-based, and that everything after that then there's no reason not to have transparency. There's no reason why you shouldn't, as an agency, battle fraud and viewability as if it's your dollars, because it is your dollars, or they are your dollars. So that's mine. You're welcome.
Yeah, that's great. I think I'm going to start there and kind of follow up on a conversation that you and I had when we were prepping for this. And you had mentioned this statement by Bob Leodis of ANA, and how he was suggesting that it was the complexity of the programmatic space that was part of the reason for the transparency issue in the first place. But I think it's much broader than that. I think that there is this history of publishers, broadcasters, and agencies playing a shill game that has never really benefited the advertiser.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We did have a great conversation around this, and the ANA's perspective, as stated by their CEO, I think, is that the complexity of the digital space creates a situation that's ripe for a lack of transparency, and I actually think it's just the opposite of that. Because again, if you have an agreement between your client and your brand, or your brand and your agency, that's based on a result, the programmatic space is so easy to give read-only access to what's actually happening, and what buy is happening, what is the what dollars are being exchanged in return for what media, and what I think is happening is, because of that lack of clarity in terms of what you're actually supposed to be doing for your brand, that agencies don't want to open up that access, and it's so easy to do it.
So I think we have not necessarily a narrow perspective, because we're all from agencies, but we all are from very different agencies. Ryan, your agency is very focused on the programmatic space, whereas the other agencies are a little broader. So I think that this is an interesting question and an answer I'd like to hear from each of you. But has the nature of programmatic fundamentally changed the relationship between the agency and the advertiser?
I guess it sort of has. I think the sort of position I would take in answering that question is that the agency has an opportunity to be less of a sort of broker of other people's inventory and more of a publisher, because when you're buying programmatically, you're creating a sort of publisher of sorts, as opposed to saying, I'm going to go to NBC and Fox and CNN and place the political ad on your behalf, and that's my value add, is talking to those people for you and picking the right placements. I'm actually going to go to the entire internet, and I'm going to find audiences for you, and I'm going to pick the right areas where I want these people to be, and it can get complicated really quickly and hard to understand. So I think in the sense that transparency is changed as a result of that is partially about the agency's willingness to have that conversation with the client, and the client's willingness to have it with the agency, right? Some clients, it's just too complicated. They just do the programmatic thing and go off and do it. And I think that level of engagement it breeds sort of lack of transparency, because it's the sort of lowest common denominator in making it work. As long as it works, it's fine. And then you have a lack of transparency.
Jessica?
Yeah, I think there's it's really what can you buy programmatically these days is the question that the clients are asking. And I think that the benefit, like a lot to what Ryan was saying, is it's no longer about like the buying power of a big holding company and the negotiation that you can, kind of use to your advantage in those conversations, because it's more about like bidding in real time and the hands on the wheel component of it. So I think like from my perspective, like the self-service, the like transparency that you get from an agency team managing those buys and kind of seeing the efficiencies from that is a value add. And I think it's a shift, right? So like when I started in this business many years ago, it was more about, okay, you get the big buy, you get the sponsored deals, you get all that at a break because you're so-and-so and you're part of a huge holding company. But it's quite a shift now.
Yeah, I think the way it's fundamentally changed the relationships is, you guys are absolutely right. In the past, it was about what unique relationships did an agency have with the vendor side of things. And now it's about what else can the agency bring to the table to make this a smarter approach. What kind of analytics are at play here to make the programmatic smarter and better. And because really what's at stake is because of the sort of democratization of programmatic, that it's very easy for clients to now say, take that in-house, right? And now, luckily for us, programmatic buyers aren't a dime a dozen, right? They are hard to find, and good ones like Luke or hey Luke, what's up? Luke's from IMM are hard to find. No resumes. You didn't bring any resumes, right? Okay, good. So the real danger is that clients are going to take that in house, and so as an agency, what you now have to do is show how you do it differently, how you do it better, and what you add to the process that a client either can't or shouldn't do.
That's great. One of the other things I heard in your initial comments there was this concept of moving from what I might term as more archaic media measurements, click-through rates, conversions, and moving away from an efficiency-based buy to more of an effectiveness-based buy. And what is the business result that is really driving? And I would like to hear from the other panelists, is that how you talk to your clients, or are we still looking at things like CPM, CTRs?
I can start. So I think it depends on the clients, right? And going back to their objectives. And, I'm working across a number of clients that are very performance-oriented. So the KPIs and measurement that we have in place is based off of that, right? What is the end state that we're trying to drive for their business, whether it's retail or financial services. So going back to my earlier points, it really is about reaching the right people, actually showing that you've reached that person, and then figuring out did they take the desired action, and then modeling off of that behavior to find more people like that. So I think the KPIs have evolved to really be more about true action that you want your desired prospect to take, and then actually proving that out, that they've actually been exposed to that ad and done that. So but again, it really depends on the clients. Like if you're working on a big brand client and the objectives are more upper funnel, then you've got a different situation.
Yes, probably same for us in a lot of ways. I would say that probably 95% of our campaigns have some sort of performance metric, whether that's a cost per acquisition, a cost per sale, an actual return on ad spend. Even if that cost per acquisition, the acquisition itself is something quite soft, we always want something post-click to kind of work back towards. So we'll do, as an example, maybe fire a pixel after the person who's clicked through has been on the site for a certain period of time, just to show that some level of intent after the click. But the ideal situation is you have something. There's some event. Most clients have some event where they're saying like, we want to fill a form out, we want to buy something, and that's the nature of our sort of client base right now. But the ones that don't, we still try to model a soft conversion into it, just so that we're optimizing towards those things that matter the most.
Great. So I want to shift a little bit. I think the transparency conversation is interesting because we're really talking about trust building and relationships with our clients, but we ultimately have SLAs and contracts that dictate those terms, regardless of how they come out and regardless of the agency-client relationship. But shifting to the topic of fraud, I think that this is a completely different thing. We're inherently talking about a criminal act. We're talking about stolen dollars, and you're putting numbers out there that are $6, $7, $8 billion. That's a lot of money, and that's a lot of money being stolen from advertisers around the world, right? Who's monitoring that? Who's benefiting from it? Who's perpetrating the crimes? We all think we know it's some guy hunched over a computer somewhere in China or Russia, but that's not really the case, although it's the case to some degree, but it's not really the case because it's a global pandemic. So why are we sitting on stage at marketing conferences talking about it rather than law enforcement bodies at the federal and international level pursuing and prosecuting this? Anybody can take it.
Well, I think it's both, right? They are criminal acts, and people who are caught doing them are processed criminally. It's the internet, so it's not exactly quite as simple as someone goes and robs a bank and find the guy with the bag of money. The guy with the bag of money could be in another country and in his basement and whatever, I don't know. But I think the reason we're talking about it here is because it's scary, right? Like if you're an advertiser and you have a certain amount of budget and someone's sitting here telling you that 3% of your budget is going to go to some guy in his basement in Africa, that's kind of scary, right? I think that sometimes controls the dialogue, where we're not talking about sort of the efficiency of digital and how it compares to maybe some of the more traditional medias, because there's like this one thing that is kind of frightening, and what are we doing about that, right? So I do believe that fraud's a big problem, but I think that there are tools out there that can help address fraud, and both third-party tools that you can leverage to ensure that you're kind of leading off in the safest way, but also sort of common sense tools like working towards numbers that are meaningful in the end, and really being sort of proactive about going through your campaigns and making sure that when something looks too good to be true, that it no longer, you're not celebrating a win that's obviously not a win, right? And so I think that's kind of the pivot. Like that's where we should be focusing on, instead of kind of focusing on the impact, which is probably always going to be there to some extent.
So the perspective that I have on that is, I think there's two things happening, and again, I feel like a one-trick pony, but I go back to the fact that there's a misalignment on what it is you're trying to do as an agency for your brand, for your client. And so let me give you an example. So at IMM, this isn't true for every client, but for I'd say maybe 40% of our clients, there's no sequential liability for the media. We negotiate a cost per event, acquisition, coupon print, whatever it happens to be, and we cover all of the agency side services, and we go buy the media, okay? And so let that sink in for a minute. There's no sequential liability. We put the dollars in the market, and we only get paid if it works, okay? So 3 years ago, people started kind of hinting about fraud, and I think there was a Wall Street Journal article that really just sort of lit a fire, but we were already working on that, and the reason we were already working on that was because those were our dollars, right? They were the agency's dollars, and so for 3% to impact $100 million agency, those are real dollars, right? And so that's number one. Number two is because by and large, the dollars that we're talking about, as an agency, what you want to do is you always want to put your best foot forward, your best face on, whatever analogy you want to put in play. And how many of you guys have actually had agency people have had an honest conversation with your client about how many dollars are actually not hitting a real live consumer, whether it's a fraud issue or a viewability issue, right? So that's the other problem, is that we're not having honest conversations with our clients about what's happening, because the fear is that the client is going to say, well, I'm going to find somebody that can do it better, right? And then you lose whatever that budget is. So I think those are the two things that are happening.
Yeah, I'd suggest it's usually not until a major fraud event has occurred that you have the conversation. Jessica, do you have to deal with that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree, with the panelists here. It's just, it's really about being transparent and taking accountability as an agency for the buying and the ecosystem that supports that. So leveraging the technology that's in place to help manage that and just reporting back and sort of monitoring those, red flags that, you see in the data.
Right. So it seems to me like in so many other areas of our lives, technology has progressed and advanced and pushed the edges of society in such a way that our laws haven't been able to keep up, and our government bodies and agencies haven't been able to keep up either. So it seems to me that it then falls back on us as agencies and the holding companies to some degree, but also the largest publishers out there. So what are the opinions on stage of what Google should be doing or what Facebook should be doing or some of the other large publishers out there? And I'm interested, Sean, to hear your perspective, if you have one, of what the holding companies are doing, because I know Martin Sorrell does not want 3% of his fortune going to hackers in Africa.
Yeah, so, well, I don't see holding company, I'll start with the holding companies. I don't see holding companies doing much. I see a lot of sort of lip service. I don't see them making the kinds of deals with clients on a large scale that I'm suggesting. I don't see them pressuring the vendors to pile in, right? What I see is and I go to a lot of the ANA conferences and I hear these conversations with our clients, with the brands, and they are beyond frustrated. And so what I would say is that it's an ecosystem issue, right? It's all the way from the folks who are on the supply side, all the way through to the client side, and right now no one's aligned, and I think until you have that alignment across the ecosystem, there's not going to be anybody pursuing criminal charges. There's not going to be anybody that's really standing up and saying, okay, I'm going to lead the charge, because the issue's so big, right, that it's going to take the entire ecosystem. Maybe it's going to be the thing that brings us all together, right, that brings down the sort of their side versus my side. That could be pretty interesting.
Have either of you two had direct conversations with your largest publishers and networks about fraud?
We definitely had published questions and dialogue with our platforms about it. So we're pretty vigilant about what goes on when something doesn't look right. We take that directly to them, and we've asked for refunds on media and things when we found issues and pass those back to our clients. It's nothing that we've sort of taken on for the greater good. We're going to try to figure this out, but certainly for our clients' good, we've advocated for them and gotten returns for them when necessary.
Yeah, I think we've seen the same thing, and it's similar in some ways to make goods for traditional media, but the publisher or the platform isn't necessarily responsible. It's it's a malicious bot or ClickFarm doing this work on the back end.
You sort of have to think about it in terms of the chain, like who gets paid, right? And so we pay the platform, who pays the exchange, who pays the publisher, right? And so we can't go to the publisher and say like, hey, we noticed your site on this. We'd like a refund. I don't know who you are, and I never paid you, right? So our responsibility as a buyer is to deal with the platform. If the platform finds that that's a big enough deal, or that they see it across their other clients to an extent that raises that enough to go to the exchange can do it, and the exchange would have multiple platforms plugging into it. They could compile all that together, and then they could go back or cancel the check to the publisher that hopefully they hadn't written yet. But you can only do sort of what's within your reach, and so that's what you can do.
So the new advertising motto should be, I don't know what half of my advertising is working or what percentage is going to fraud.
Did I just say that? I honestly, I think we should all be vigilant. I think that if it's 3%, I don't want to say that that's an acceptable number. but I would rather spend, more of my time focusing on how to make the campaign work better. And if I find a rounding error because of fraud, I can knock it out myself quickly when it costs $3 instead of $30,000, right? And if I do that early, I've sort of helped my clients, and we maintain lists that we block for all of our clients for anything that looks suspicious. Our platforms do the same thing, and I'm sure the exchanges do the same thing on top of that. So everybody's kind of doing their part, and also focusing on creating outcomes for the client. So we can all focus on like what's wrong with the ecosystem, or we can focus on maximizing what's right about it. That's the tact we take.
So Jessica, does Merkle have trading desk?
Yeah, so we have a whole
in-house?
group of people that would manage all of this. I'm more on the account side, so in terms of like speaking to like the technology behind it, like that's not like necessarily my purview, but I would say that echoing a lot of what Ryan said, like, it's about the platforms and really like kind of making sure you have those relationships in place and, doing your diligence there. But really going back to earlier points, it's moving away from cookies and really getting to the person and understanding how you can tap into those IDs and the match rates there. The closer you get to that other problem goes away, right? Because then you can validate that you've actually reached an individual. So I think there's just so much that goes on within the cross-platform gaps and tracking mobile and all of that just creates a lot of room for, error, so to speak. But I think if you just take a step back, think about how you're doing your buying and plan at a people-based way, then you're kind of giving yourself the best shot. Take advantage of the technology that's in place to help set those guardrails and mitigate against the fraud and all of that, but think about it from reaching an individual first.
Nice, thank you. So I think I'm going to move on to our third kind of issue area, which is the viewability issue. And I think back to just 2 years ago, and we weren't even saying viewability, we were saying things like below the fold and using these other terms. Why has viewability become such a hot issue, and why now? Jessica, maybe we'll start with you.
I think it's because everybody is sort of catching on, and like I said before, it's what can we buy programmatically, and so the shift in buying has just like kind of created a lot of interest and questions around, okay, well, I'm buying this in real time, and I'm, what am I actually getting? And then like the rise of mobile is creating a lot of challenges there. So I think just like with the shift in buying going this way is kind of making this a bigger conversation, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, I can add to that. I'd say measurement's also another way that viewability has kind of moved the conversation forward. I don't think it's always been the case where we can measure how long an ad was viewable for, or the position on the site, or separating the issue from fraud. Like just is someone actually seeing this ad? And the fact that you can measure that someone has seen an ad, I think is testament to how powerful digital is. Especially when you compare it with some of the other formats. But it does create a conversation where we start wondering, what it's worth to pay in advance for viewability.
I would also add, like, layering in the technology to buy on a viewable basis only isn't always going to pay out for your efficiencies, right? If you're working within CPA guardrails, like sometimes just optimizing to a threshold above the average for viewability, like whatever it is, maybe you want to optimize to 70% versus 50%, which is more of the benchmark. You're going to kind of care for that without layering an additional tax into the buying ecosystem, because sometimes adding in those technologies, while they're great in the sense that like you can guarantee it's viewable, there's a fee there. So I think you have to do that, have that thoughtful conversation and really think about it. Well, could I just optimize versus actually paying a premium to do that?
I think one of the other reasons why we're talking about viewability, because there's viewability as like a best practice, and then there's the fraud viewability, right? And I think the reason that we're talking about it is because it's kind of getting lumped in together. And so we've already talked about the fraud thing, but I think the best practices side of viewability is is becoming such a centerpiece of the conversation because of the advancement and the sort of reduction in reliance on things like last click and stuff like that. So, when you start to use things like fractional attribution to make your optimization decisions, then it's important to understand, what was the viewability of that ad, and how did it play in the sort of, how a consumer, the journey from the first ad to the last ad to the actual event and play. So that's why I think we're probably talking about it a little bit more.
So has viewability been a conversation driven by the agencies to the publishers and the networks, or is that something your clients are asking you about?
Clients are definitely asking about it. We just updated a POV recently from one of my clients. Yes, it's constantly a topic for us.
Yeah, I think because we're doing a lot more things like video ad units and things like that. So as you begin to put more dollars into production value, I think that naturally becomes a question. And I think it's for us at IMM, we talk about it just as much as our clients do. So I think it's 50-50 depending on the client.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's one of these three areas where I think we've seen the publishers, the networks, yes, asking their publishers, but the publishers themselves, especially the biggest publishers, the weather.coms, the Forbes, the New York Times, doing complete redesigns of their websites to address viewability. And I think that it's interesting if we then take a step back and we take viewability, transparency, fraud, all of these topics we've talked about, and how the programmatic industry at large, publishers, the ad tech, the agencies, are doing as much as they can to address these issues. I think more so than we've seen in a lot of other areas of the marketing and advertising industry. So my question here is, will programmatic be a driver to force change in other areas of digital media and even going into broadcast and traditional media? Specifically the way it's bought and sold.
Yeah, I can't wait until we have a lot more programmatic broadcast. I think it is. I think it kind of is showing us that that this, what we're seeing right now represents the future, right? It represents how we need to be prepared to plan, buy, and optimize media. I love the fact that you're buying audience, right? In programmatic, I think that to me, beyond exchange rate, beyond it being an exchange and beyond the democratization and all that stuff, the simple fact that it changes from buying a placement on a site to buying an audience is that was the transformative thing. And I think when you begin to play, we were talking earlier, the question for Alex was about versioning on television for the Super Bowl. I don't know about Super Bowl, but the ability to apply audience buying, whether it's in digital or in broadcast. We're already doing it in print, direct mail and that sort of thing. But to me, that will be the transformative thing, and I can't wait for that. I don't know who's going to get to do it, but I think the digital space should. But that's my vote.
Any other thoughts on the changes in programmatic affecting digital media at large or broadcast?
I think I would say that it's not necessarily programmatically driven. I think buying styles can be significantly impacted by programmatic. For example, as a media buying shop, we sort of take a programmatic first approach. So we'll test things in an open market and figure out what we can learn. And then we might do a preferred deal to kind of expand our reach into those areas and build on that. And then if we still don't have what we need, we might actually do a direct site placement in order to get the reach that we want on something that's performing highly. So instead of the sort of traditional way of using research tools and trying to understand how an audience indexes to a publication, we're doing sort of real-time research where we're saying, how does an audience react to a brand, and then how do you maximize that buy? And so it's a process that kind of moves on. So does that change TV buying over time? Well, if I could programmatically test TV and figure out what sites I want to buy, then that'd be fantastic. I would do that all day. And so I think as technology evolves with different sort of medias and we're able to do more things like that and take a test and learn approach, then I think the whole landscape changes and it gets better and better for advertisers because their media gets more and more efficient. But it will bring along a cast of nasty things as well. Measurement.
Great. So I do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, but I just want to throw one more question at the panel, and it's outside of what we've been talking about, but it's typically the fourth rider, if you will, of this particular apocalypse, and that is ad blocking. Something that we're all dealing with. I know we're seeing it on a pretty regular basis, starting to get a lot of questions from clients about how they deal with ad blocking. And my question to the audience is, what we hear from the actual consumer side is ad blocking slows down my web page loads, it ruins my online experience. So how do we as agencies convince our advertisers that they can engage with their prospects or customers, delivering a rich experience that the customer actually wants to engage with, but delivering that brand experience for the advertiser? Sean, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think, my perspective, and my partner back there at Fact and Fiction, Kyle, will agree, is that you have to start with great creative. And I think that's been the problem, right? If you think about ad blocking, it's because consumers are annoyed, right? They're annoyed with what we're doing. And that's where the problem is. If you're not creating something that a consumer wants to engage with, right? You have to know who you're talking to. You have to know what the context is in which, where you're going to find them. And if you're not able to create that experience, people are going to ad block you. And to me, that's where it starts, and that's the conversation that we need to be having with our clients, is helping them understand that we're all the cause of that, right? And the lack of good creative is what's causing consumers to initiate the ad blocking.
I just blame publishers.
I agree with that, but I think it's bigger than just creative. I think it's about offering some sort of value to the customer, like a usability. We're beyond just looking at an ad and reacting to it, right? It's the consumers engaging and driving the conversation. It's you can't just push a message. So I think it's a conversation about, are you adding value? Are you providing some type of usable feature to the prospect? It goes back to what you're saying about context. What device are they on? What do you know about them? Where are they in their journey? If the more personalized and tailored you can be in answering all of that and then providing value to them, the better.
Yeah, just to kind of build on that, those two ideas, which I think are great. We had an example last year. We worked with a ski resort in West Virginia, and they had one of the worst ski seasons ever. Yeah. And the resort was closed until early January, and when they opened up, they wanted to get the word out. And so the creative agency we were working with, Bravo Echo, came up with a dynamic creative strategy, which was communicating to people what the conditions were on the mountain. So they started getting a whole bunch of storms. They had all these great powder day reports, the amount of terrain that was open. And we were using audience buying technology and strategies to connect with the people who were engaging with the brand, or through the CRM lists and things that, Facebook friends, whatever it was that we had on them to get this message, this really valuable message, which could move the brand, and get those people activated to buy. We're connecting them directly with smart creative that had utility. And I think when you have that sort of model and you get creative and you're like, that's helpful. That's great. No one's going to block that, right? Unfortunately, I don't think you can block, specific, creatives. So it's, everybody's got to kind of up their game. And if we're just slamming people with useless messaging and the same creative over and over and over with no frequency capping and no sort of privacy sense, then we're not going to get there. But there is a way, right? This is a direct connection with your consumers in the same way that you would send an email message in a very well-written way to a person on your email list. You can connect directly with that same person through programmatic, and you can give them something that they want to know.
So that's awesome insight, guys. Great experience share. I really appreciate it. And maybe we can open it up to questions.
Yeah, sure. We can take a question or two.
I can't believe this
Before we
many
head off to drinks.
people are
Yeah,
still
there's
here.
one over here. Yeah.
This best panel
Right
of the
there.
day. Yeah. I think we beat Alex.
Tell us your name and who you work for.
Hi, I'm Melanie. I work for the Integer Group. So it seems like a lot of the programmatic buying, we've been finding issues after the fact. So it started with fraud. We found out there was a lot of bots happening. Viewability, we found out our ads weren't being seen. We're finding collusion. So our ads are running 5 times on a page to the same person. You know, I know Ryan mentioned on the back end, we can go to these vendors and say, hey, we're not going to pay for this, but what can we be doing proactively with our vendor partners to say, hey, we want to make sure that you're just as vested in our clients as we are. What are you guys doing on the forefront to make sure that our inventory is running correctly and, you know, it's not being wasted?
Yeah, so it's funny. We were talking to a client over in Ohio earlier this year, and they had a very similar experience where they said, you know, they were not that sophisticated in the digital space, and they said, oh yeah, that we tried that programmatic stuff, it didn't work. You know, there was a lot of stuff that wasn't seen, and you know, we just had lots of problems. So, and after some probing, you know, the question was, well, how did you guys manage that, right? How did you manage that buy? And we call it sort of a set it and forget it kind of approach, which is, you know, you do this programmatic buy, which is, you know, a lot of, or some folks use programmatic as an efficiency mechanism, right? Sort of like the DRTV age, where you're buying DRTV and you're getting that DRTV discount, but you're not really doing DRTV. It's the same with programmatic, in my perspective. You can't make a programmatic buy using it to get some sort of efficiency, so you get like a discount, and then expect it to perform awesome, right? You have to manage it, and you have to look at it on a daily basis. I don't know, how many times do you look at your campaigns, Luke? All day long, right? All day long, and he's constantly pulling levers and finding problems and shutting stuff down and moving dollars, and so, you know, I say the same thing to you that I say to folks that want to get into DRTV, and that is, if you want to do it, you have to go all in, right? Otherwise, you're going to run into those problems, but you're not going to find them until it's already over.
Yeah, I think that there might be this misconception that because of the accessibility into do-it-yourself platforms, that it's easy to do it yourself, where it does take some expertise, some training, some knowledge about how to run those programs and run them properly.
Yeah, I think also if you're using a managed service, you know, I would say to just really evaluate who, you know, the partner. There's different ways that structurally, like, you can create alignment, whether it's contractual or it's just, you know, having a client that's transparent with you. Because the only way that it's going to work if you're not doing the buy yourself is that you have a partner who's proactively looking for those things for you, because that's not the first time they've seen that across a campaign. They probably set it up and said, oh, this will work. They're going to be excited about this, right? And in reality, they knew that either something wasn't right or there was a problem that they didn't proactively communicate to you, and I would argue that there's a lack of trust potentially if that's the case. So I would evaluate that.
Hi, I'm Joel Grubwa from Blue Onion Media, and I guess this is mostly for Sean. It's interesting. Yeah, that's right. Well, you kind of outlined the performance-based model that you guys are using, and I've been for a few years trying to coach a lot of clients into something like that, even though they're not paying that way. So I think it's a little more complicated than maybe it sounds, and I'm just curious how you can set up, and it's maybe because I'm coming from a integrated model where we'll have TV running and print or something else, or, you know, other print pieces, whatever, and we'll have a piece of it. Can you talk about how you set up an ecosystem that can really work for performance pay kind of a model?
Yeah, sure. No, it's not. It sounds really easy, but it doesn't sound that easy. It's difficult, and it requires a client, a brand that is deeply involved in understanding of what their economics look like, right? You can't even really have this conversation with a client unless they know things like their lifetime value of their customer, right? And you know, what their allowable is, right, on an acquisition or a retention event or something like that. Because unless you have those basic level, you know, and a lot of our clients, a lot of our brands don't know that, right? or maybe the folks that we're dealing with don't know that. Until they do, you can't even really have the first conversation. But I would argue that as marketers and as partners to our brands, we got to press them to know that stuff. Whether it becomes the basis of the economic relationship or not, it's such critical information, and that's like table stakes, right? And then from there, you have to know, as an agency, you have to be really in tune with costs in the marketplace, right? What is it going to cost me to go find a customer that looks like that at scale, right? And then you have to know exactly what it's going to take you, not only from a pass-through media perspective, but what is your agency cost in terms of time to do all of these things. And so unless you have a really tight ship, right, then that model can start to break down. Now, and then I guess the biggest thing is that you have to have a client that's willing to enter into that kind of relationship. And sometimes when you have this conversation with clients, they it's like a barter conversation, right? It starts to get into territory that no one's comfortable with because no one understands. But that I think that process also lends itself to a level of transparency and trust, because then they know exactly what you're doing, what it's costing you. You know exactly what they need, what they need to make from a customer. And that, when you have that sort of end-to-end transparency, like that's some good stuff right there. That results in long-term relationships, and it also results in much more sort of collaborative and partnership-based conversations. They can tell you when their economics change, right? And then because that affects the whole ecosystem. So there's a lot to it, but that's in a nutshell.
It sounds like all the agencies and clients could be rolling in daisies together, but I think that if that actually happened, we'd all be sitting up here talking about transparency and fraud on the client side.
We got one more, and then refreshments. Here we go.
Sorry, I'm not the guy. From a vendor point of view, I'm Jeremy from Tremor Video. It's interesting that you talked about viewability. You didn't talk about the tech behind it and what you are getting from your partners and so on. I'd just like to understand, particularly Ryan, you said you're from a technical background in years gone by. Who are you using to look at your viewability, measuring your viewability? Are you pushing them on better rates than 50% benchmark is really low. 70% goal I think is quite low as well for video. So just to understand from you guys where you're going with that.
Yeah, I'm sure that 50% was for display generally. I think video's viewability rates are significantly higher at baseline. What we use is a couple different things. Our platforms have built-in viewability metrics, and then our ad server is a way that we sort of cross-check to make sure that those two things are working hand in hand. When it comes to buying against viewability, we'll layer in a third party. There's several of them. I wouldn't say I have a loyalty to any of them, but sometimes clients actually come to us with we want to, can you give us IAS or whatever it is, and so we'll layer that stuff in. Typically we don't like to do that. We would rather measure based on sort of the lower level dimensions, so that we're not limiting reach right off the bat and saying like, oh, we don't want anything as long as this vendor says it's okay. Because that just sort of slows us down out of the gate. Whereas we could probably find big wins from viewability perspective by looking at a sort of site level viewability list and carving it up that way.
Awesome. Do we have one more question?
I think Ross.
I don't see one.
No.
Hands raised. No.
Well, it's hot in here, but the drinks are cold.
As they say, right? So,
great.
Thank you.
Thanks
you,
to the
Aaron.
panel.
Thanks, panels. Great panels. Great last panel today. Thank you, guys. So, as we've been telling you all day, across the street we'll be having drinks, courtesy of Ibotta. So, they're what, across the street, John, above Starbucks?
Yeah,
Is that
just
right?
go over here to the Starbucks and then walk right across the street, and it's fourth floor. Fourth floor. Look for listen for the noise. I'm sure it'll be a ruckus.
Okay. Well,
And
hope
there'll
to
be
see you
people in
all
the lobby
there.
showing you.
Thank
And,
you guys for
actually-
sticking around, and thank you for coming. That does it for me for Home at Denver. I hope you had a good time today and learned something.
Before we go, I just want to say thank you to Ross Fadner, who's our program director. Big round of applause for Ross. All the speakers, all the attendees, and also, of course, our famous sponsors, Centro, Epiphany, Gum Gum, Ibotta, and Sovereign, thanks so much for bankrolling this so we could do this today, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.